And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is the author, Dr. Mona Sobhani, who holds a doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Southern California and completed a post-doctoral fellowship at Vanderbilt University with the MacArthur Foundation Law and Neuroscience Project. Her book is called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a Neuroscientist's Discovery of the Ineffable Mysteries of the Universe. Dr. Sobhani, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you. And I know this may seem like a simple question, but what does a cognitive neuroscientist do?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We study the brain in humans. Well, not always humans, but that's what I did. Most of us do it in humans. So I used to do human subject research and essentially using MRI or EEG or different technologies to measure activity and structure of the human brain to understand it better. It's essentially what we do.
Did you have some sort of spiritually transformative experience or a dark night of the soul or anything like that that started you down the path of looking at spiritual phenomena?
Oh, yes, definitely. I was not into spirituality or religion before a certain time in my life, which at this point was a few years ago. So it wasn't one event. It wasn't like some people have one just like 5 minutes that changes their life. It wasn't like that for me. It was more slow and over the course of a few years. And it came through it wasn't direct, it was through my mother. So I'm Persian, and in our culture, we use divination. So my mom would use coffee grinds to divine or intuit things about people's past, present, and future. And she would do it for me when I came home on the weekends. And I didn't believe in it, right? Because at the time, I was a graduate student in neuroscience. But I noticed over the years that what she said would come true. And sometimes it would be months in advance. And then she would have all these details about these intimate and personal and really meaningful moments of my life that there's no way that she would know. So it got my attention. And then I could never explain it with science because there's no framework in mainstream science to explain this. So I just ignored, or I just lived in cognitive dissonance. I just kept the two worlds separate. But then I had two emotional life events. One was the death of someone I knew, and one was the ending of a relationship. And my mom saw those events and saw these, details about those events. And then I think because I was, kind of vulnerable because of the emotional nature of those events. And then I was also going through an existential crisis at the same time. So all of these factors combined made me more sensitive to what she was doing. And then it kind of scared me. And I was whereas normally I could just live in dissonance and be like, whatever, this is not a big deal. But at that time, it started to really get to me. And I think I was already on not stable ground. And so when those events happened, I started to get more curious about what is the nature of the universe and why does this modality or this thing that my mom does, how can it be so at odds with science, which is what I used to understand the world, but it's correct and it works. And that launched me on a curiosity journey, kind of. I just opened my mind. And they say that you need some sort of breaking experience to break open, which is what happened to me. So then I just got curious, and my friends and I went to get psychic readings for the first time. For me, they took me. And then we went a bunch of times, and I thought, this is so crazy. These people know things, multiple variables, an impressive number of variables on certain topics in my life that they couldn't get. There were things from my past that were so specific. So I got interested in that. And then through those readings, they would mention spiritual frameworks to me, like, oh, we come here to learn lessons, or this person was a soulmate, or this is a soul group thing. And I had no idea what any of that meant and went straight over my head. But I recorded the sessions and took notes. And then later, when I heard, I was listening to not a spiritual podcast. It was like a random, it was Chelsea Handler, who's an American comedian. This is her podcast, but she had a psychic medium on, and that lady, Laura Lynn Jackson, talked about the framework. And I was like, oh, this is what all those psychics or intuitives told me. So then I went back, and then that's when I got interested in that, the spirituality side of it. And before, it just went over my head. I didn't understand it. And then suddenly the spiritual aspect started to come in, and I thought, oh, like they're actually giving a framework of meaning to these experiences. And so I got curious about that. And on the podcast, they mentioned a book, Many Lives, Many Masters. And so that was like the book experience. That was like the tipping point of, after that, I dove in headfirst to learning as much as I could.
As a scientist, have you come up with a model on how these psychics and mediums are able to access this information?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. And one of the driving forces at the beginning of the journey was to answer that question. I was so dead set on coming up with an answer. But I realized when I started digging into all of the, not only research, but the theories of how this could work and the theories of consciousness or spirituality, I realized that there's a lot of different ways that it could be possible. So I gave up personally trying to understand it.
There's not a certain hypothesis that resonates with you?
Oh, with me, so I think that so one of them is, it's actually, you step back from physicalism, from the idea that everything is only physical in matter. And then there's some philosophies that suggest consciousness could be energy or information or something that is a fundamental part of the universe, just like we consider matter fundamental right now. And so I feel like that's where I lean towards, is that consciousness is something we don't understand what it is, but that it's a fundamental part of the universe, of the basic building blocks, and that it's more like a field or something in the background that we can access. So, or it makes up our reality or something like that. So I don't look for physical mechanisms anymore, but I feel like whatever it is, it's that. It's like something where it's actually, we have like the perfect analogy now where we have cloud computing, right? And like things are in the cloud. You don't have to have a program on your computer anymore. It's sort of just, I think of it just like that. And that's what I've found in the scientific literature. And that's what I put in my book, like some examples of models. Like these things are being published now by a lot of scientists saying, well, maybe consciousness is a field. Maybe we access it through certain, like somehow. So that's how I think of it now.
Well, do you think that your own consciousness is created by the brain, or it's something separate from the body, and your brain is like the computer that receives that signal from the internet?
Yeah, I think of it more like it's like we're receivers. Like our brains are receivers. Like you need it. It's like a TV. You need it to receive the signal, but just because the brain or the receiver gets destroyed doesn't mean this, the actual signal is destroyed. And I think that when you cite things like psychic experiences, or there's a lot of evidence for psychic, I mean, that's pretty well established. But you hear all kinds of really interesting phenomena, and those are more easily explained by a model like that than by what scientific materialism or what we use in mainstream science. Like mainstream science can't explain it. But if you think of it more like your brain as a filter or a receiver, then it makes more sense.
Do you ever think about that perhaps our entire reality is a mock-up from our collective consciousness?
I do sometimes. Yeah, sometimes I haven't ruled that out. Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I don't think there's not enough evidence to discount some of those wilder theories, or what we consider wild just because of the perspective we come from. But yeah, I think anything's possible.
I think one puzzle for me is that some of the guests will talk about that we have our consciousness, but our brain also interjects thoughts too with our consciousness. And
Yeah.
so it's the combination of direct thoughts from our consciousness and some from our brain at the same time. And maybe the ones that come from our brain are more about survival of the brain and the body.
Yeah.
Does that
Yes.
mean anything to you?
Yes, absolutely. It's yeah, I started to think about it sort of like that, where and when you go into really deep meditative or even psychedelic or any kind of altered state of consciousness state, you can access that more pure, like ground of being or more pure consciousness where it's just awareness, and it's a different quality than your normal everyday thinking. And once you get into these practices, you can start to discern the difference between them. So, and that's what I think, I don't know, to me, a little bit of spirituality or wisdom is being able to sit and become familiar with the different states of your own consciousness so that you can discern the difference. But yeah, I think your ego mind, or whatever you want to call it, it's kind of like the baby mind, like the human little mind, which is what you become really familiar to hearing day in and day out, is very concerned with your survival and with protecting your feelings and your actual physical safety and all of those things. Whereas your higher mind, or your pure consciousness, it just is a state of being and awareness, and it's much more like it doesn't have all of that anxiety and tension and fear that the smaller mind does. So yeah, I definitely think they're separate, and I think that if you get into these deeper states, you can start to really discern, when you're hearing one, or when you're feeling one, or when you're being one. It starts to become clear.
I've interviewed a lot of people who've had near-death experiences, and a common theme is when they're on the other side, not only do they experience immeasurable amounts of love, but they forget about all the problems of this world or this realm. And so maybe once you drop the brain, all those anxiety thoughts and all those survival thoughts disappear.
Yeah. And that's one of the beauties of like a practice like meditation or breath work, is that it helps you get to that state more quickly and more easily and whenever you want. So that you can kind of drop away from the small mind, which is very loud and just constantly going all day.
Mm-hmm. Where are you at on the higher self and other dimensions?
Yeah, I feel like, um, it's interesting. I mean, I believe there's other dimensions. I think that a lot of physics is suggesting that there probably is. I have no problem with that. I think most people are on board with that. I think mainstream entertainment is on board with that. So yeah, I definitely think that. I think that there's, and like in terms of a higher self, you mean that has your like best interests in mind type of thing?
They use the word higher self. I like to use the word complete self. It's like our complete consciousness is on the other side. Like we know everything there, and only a filtered version of us is here. And
Right.
so when these psychics are either tapping into their own higher self and know everything, or some kind of unified field of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that what I was just mentioning about smaller mind versus like the higher mind or the higher self, I think it is that. I think there is like some core aspect of you that runs through or that has the answers. And that's what and again, when you go into like altered states of consciousness, you can more easily get access to that because you quiet the monkey mind or whatever, the
Mm-hmm.
smaller mind, you quiet it so you can hear. And that it has a lot more intelligence to guide you. And you hear that a lot in psychedelics, but also in breath work and stuff. Like they call it this innate healing intelligence, or innate intelligence that it knows what to do to heal you, or it knows how to guide you. And your job is kind of to just get your smaller mind quiet and get into a state where you can hear it and receive that wisdom.
All right, your book is called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena. And so, can you give us some of your best examples of spiritual phenomena that have been proven?
Yeah, I think, I mean, would it stand up in the like court of science? um, there's few things. That was right. I came to this as a scientific materialist, and I went through all the literature, and I thought, um, some of it, it's so interesting. Actually, Jeff Kripal, who is the chair of philosophy and religious thought at Rice University, talks about this, and it's so true. Like sometimes these experiences, a lot of times actually, they happen in traumatic situations or under really exceptional circumstances. So then when you take them into the lab and you're trying to study it, of course you're not going to replicate them because it's not like a traumatic experience and it's not a natural setting. And so that's kind of where you find this. Sometimes it can be hard to capture these, especially the spiritual ones, right? Like psychic phenomena, it's been pretty well studied over the last 100 years. And in my book, I like summarized all the research, and I was like, this is pretty indisputable. You can't be a scientist and look at this and say it's not. But the more spiritual stuff is a little more, it's very strong. It's just, does it conform to our scientific, standards? Maybe not, but I always think now the universe has no obligation to give us what we want in the format we want it in. Like it exists as it is, and we're just the one with trying to say, no, you have to put your answer in this box. But for me, I would say what really caught my attention in the beginning was, which is definitely not, like a scientist would not put this as scientific evidence, but the past life regression stuff was really interesting to me because there were a lot of behavioral therapists from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, so like before the internet, who stumbled across this work, and they were atheists, they didn't believe, they were like Freudians or whatever, and stumbled across it, started using it, and found that not only was it very healing for their patients, but also that all of their patients, or like thousands of them from each of these practitioners, would report the same spiritual framework when they were put in a regressed, relaxed, hypnotic state. And that was like, oh, I chose to come back. We're here to learn lessons. These are my guides, or whatever it is. And I thought that was just a very strange phenomena. Like, just even if you're not looking at this from a spiritual perspective, it's like if you put someone in a regressed state, or thousands of people, and any of them report the same thing, it's already pretty strange. It's already a very interesting phenomena. So the fact that they were reporting a spiritual framework that a lot of them were Westerners, they weren't even familiar with, or it's not as common as Christianity in the West, I thought that was really weird, very weird, and I still think it is. So, and I think it just speaks in, it doesn't mean it's true, right? Like, again, if you're trying to apply strict science to it, doesn't mean it's true, but it's an interesting phenomena. It's like, why do you get that story? So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then I think the mediumship research is starting to be, it's building. There's not a lot of it because there's not a lot of funding in this area, but the Windbridge Institute has done some good research doing like quintuple blinded, where everyone's blinded, like the medium is blinded, the researcher's blinded, the sitter's blinded, showing pretty good evidence for them receiving veridical information. And again, in that space, there's a lot of debate of like, oh, but are they really talking to a spirit or consciousness, or are they picking up telepathically from the person? And is there a distinction or difference there? Like, that's an ongoing debate. So I think the reincarnation research is also extremely interesting. I think the past life regression is what pulled me in, but the reincarnation research is what blew my mind. And it was from the University of Virginia. It's Ian Stevenson, and I think Jim Tucker is continuing that research now, but looking at children ages 2 to 5 who, carried over or have memories from what they claim are past lives. And they have this whole research protocol around, what to ask them about those lives to see if they can identify the people. And I think there's like over 3,000 cases. And I think in over 65% of the cases, they're able to identify the former identity of the person based on what the children say. And they have, because it's been going on for years, they had all these like kind of well vetted, I would say, protocols. So I thought that was very strong evidence. I don't know how else you would explain that. I mean, you're going to have to get, creative to explain that in some other way. So to me, that was very strong. And then, of course, what's interesting is that a lot of what those children report matches what comes out of the past life regression literature when they're reporting a spiritual framework, which matches many times what near-death experiencers report. Not always, of course. Sometimes it varies culture to culture, but I would say largely they match. So to me, to say it blew my mind is really an understatement. I think I just like sat in my room staring at the wall, like I don't understand what I just read. But yeah, to me it was pretty convincing. But it was not easy. I didn't just believe it. It took a long time to change my mind and flip my worldview and to understand everything. But as far as evidence goes, it's pretty strong evidence that something's going on, or we don't have the whole story.
I'm not sure where you are in your career path. Obviously, we just met, but have you considered going back and researching some of these topics?
I'm not really into research anymore, but I feel like, I could, but it's not my passion, I would say, anymore. It doesn't bring me joy, as Marie Kondo would say. I don't enjoy it. It's such a slog. I'm just not that into it anymore, but I do love translate. I still love reading and writing and thinking and summarizing and explain and translating it for people because I really do love it. I just don't love doing it anymore. But I guess never say never.
Right. Well, the subtitle of your book, as you know, is A Neuroscientist's Discovery of the Ineffable Mysteries of the Universe. So, can you tell us some of your favorite ineffable mysteries out there?
I think what we just discussed is one of them, that there's this emerging spiritual framework that comes out of altered states of consciousness that not always, but sometimes is coherent. I think what's fascinating is, so when you come at this from my perspective, like someone like me, super scientific materialist, I was so in my head, so rational, so in everyday reality. I didn't know what an altered state of consciousness was. I did meditate, but I didn't do anything else, no breath work, no psychedelics, nothing like that. I think though, when you start doing some of these practices and you start experiencing these different ways of being, like you start to feel the interconnectedness and feel the love and see things differently. And you can also feel the depth of your emotions. Like it's almost like if you had it's like through our life experiences, we place some boxes around the emotions that we can feel because it's just what happens to us through life. And when you go into these states, sometimes those are blown open. And so you suddenly can feel so much more deeply than you remember, right? Like you probably, when you were a kid, you felt that because you didn't have the boxes around everything. But as an adult for years and years, like you haven't felt the depth of those emotions. And I think that I started to experience that with these practices, and that really blew my mind. And then I just thought, honestly, that's to me a beautiful mystery of being a human, is like being able to experience all these different states and like the depth and the just different formations that they can take in and through you. I just think those are in and of themselves beautiful.
Well, that's a good reason to come here, because if the only thing you experience on the other side is love, then that would, give you some options when you get here.
Right. Yeah. So it's funny you say that, because when I started getting into this, I remember reading that, like, oh, we come here to, and I was moving through a lot of difficult emotion. I mean, who isn't as a human all the time, but especially at the time, I was moving through a lot of difficult emotions. And I remember thinking, I would never have chosen this. I would never come back to feel this. But then over the course of the journey, like I just said, well, you start to become more familiar with your landscape, your emotional landscape, your consciousness landscape. And then you're like, oh, okay, I guess I see. I mean, even that process of realizing that you've put boundaries around yourself and then breaking them open is like really beautiful and transformational. So even just that process, you're like, yeah, I guess I could see why this is kind of like a game. It's like breaking through the levels, right? Learning the tricks and stuff. And then you're like, well, I guess I could see it.
I don't know if you still are in contact with your colleagues or, your social circles are still together, but if so, what do they think about what you're doing now?
I interviewed a lot of well, some, not a lot. It was during COVID, but I interviewed some of my colleagues when I was just opening up to this field because I thought I was crazy. I started to have an identity crisis and I thought, oh, I wonder if any of my colleagues are spiritual or religious or if they are open to anomalous phenomena. Like we had never talked about those things. And so I interviewed a lot of them and found that they all had stories, they all had their own experiences, they all had people in their lives who had experiences. And it seemed like most of them were much more open to the mysteries of the universe than I was. I think I was like one of the more closed off scientists, apparently. And so, yeah, I mean, I think all of them, I think we all come to neuroscience from different angles. But, one of my friends told me, he's like, I actually came to neuroscience because I was interested in philosophy and understanding reality, but I thought a practical way to do it would be through neuroscience. Um, and so I think people come to neuroscience as a certain type of person to begin with, and they are already more interested, a little more philosophically minded and whatnot. So I found them to be pretty open. I've had a lot of them share, experiences with me. A lot of other scientists have reached out, and like they want to talk about these things, and they've had a lot of their own experiences. So I kept saying in my book, these are human experiences that we do not deny and stigmatize, but they're human and they happen to everyone. And I've definitely found that to be true because scientists are still human. Like we may deny them more than others, but if they happen to you, they stay with you. And yeah, I've had people reach out, and sometimes it's the first time they're sharing their story with anyone, and that makes me very sad. I mean, happy that I could do it for them, but just very sad that like you haven't been able to share this with anyone. So me and a collaborator have been trying to. We've held two events at our annual neuroscience conference this year and last to try to open like dialogue and open space to talk about these experiences.
In your book, you said that the old you would have hated the new you. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Um, so the old me was, very wrapped up in my identity as a smart scientist. And I was very condescending to, or, well, the narrative in mainstream science is that humans need religion or spirituality to cope with the difficulty of existence. Like it's just a coping mechanism, but it's not true. And I definitely adopted that and um, thought that, I mean, I guess I just never needed spirituality, I guess, up until that point in my life. So I just didn't understand it. And I was never an atheist. I was more of an agnostic. Like I just didn't think we could prove it one way or another. So why bother? Um, but yeah, I was definitely a little condescending and arrogant in my identity. So yeah, I would have really been shocked at the new me because now I'm much more open-minded and I cry all the time now because I opened my heart because it was closed off for so long. And yeah, but I was very serious and arrogant and not really comfortable with emotions. Um, and so I think I would be horrified like at the new me who's now I just try to stay open to ideas. I listen. I don't really, I thought I had it right with science. And then after I read all those literature, all that evidence, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's so much I don't know that now I try not to form new, I just try to let it all flow through and try not to attach to any of them. And so, but I think that old me wouldn't have understood that. My self-worth was too tied up in my identity for that to happen. So now I'm just much more open, or like, um, I'm from LA and there's a lot of spiritual new age stuff here. So, but I think, yeah, I think old me would have been like some of the spaces I'm in now. Sometimes I'll like think back to my old self and I'd be like, oh man, I would have been so uncomfortable here before, or I would be horrified to see myself here in the future. But now I don't care.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you were going through an existential crisis, and you may have been in a position to be susceptible to all this stuff. Would the old you say that that's just all it really is? So you were at a low point in your life and you fell victim to all this woo-woo?
Yeah, that's what I said to myself a lot for a long time. Oh my gosh, every morning I woke up and I was like, oh, you fell for it. And then, but what helped was that I had all this actual evidence and I would review it in my mind every day. And that's what I had to do. So that's why I think I also mentioned it's not like your beliefs can be flipped overnight, right? Because your old beliefs, I mean, they're there like as a shortcut on your desktop, whereas the new belief is like hidden way inside the computer. So it takes a while to update your neural representations, your beliefs, and that's what I had to do. Like every morning I'd wake up and think, oh, you fell for it. And it would take a long time to update it, but I came up with practices. I mean, one thing that helped was that reviewing the literature every day, like in my head, or just reminding me. I even started printing out experiments and just put them on my cork board above my desk, so that when I had moments of doubt throughout the day, which would happen all the time, be like, oh no, like because if I read something skeptical or something, then I would look at the experiments and be like, no, I mean, it's a pretty good experiment, like. And then I think also finding communities. I found there were quite a few professional associations of scientists, I'm trying to remember the name of it, the Academy of the Associate Post-Materialist Scientists. There's like the Scientific and Medical Network. I found all these groups of scientists and physicians and scholars who were at this intersection of science and spirituality, and they would talk about these consciousness and the physics, and they would talk about all this stuff all the time. So I joined those groups, and I think the community really helped a lot, because once I joined those, suddenly I had also so much more science and more resources at my fingertips, but also just a community of like-minded people, how they accomplished. Some were Nobel Prize winners, right? Like people who are way smarter than even me. To be, I'll be like, oh my God, well, if he like, well, I want to know his journey. What evidence did he review to get to where he's at? But I think all of that helped, but it was definitely not an easy thing to flip my worldview.
Do you mind sharing what caused your existential crisis?
Well, I don't really know. I think I think part of it was that, so I was doing my PhD for 6 years, and when you're doing a PhD, it's a very clear goal, and you kind of block everything else out just so you can get to the end of the road on that. And then once that happened and I got a job, well, I did a postdoc, but then I got a job, and once I was in the working world, I felt a kind of like sudden lack of meaning, because there wasn't a clear goal like the PhD anymore. So I wasn't working towards anything in particular, and I felt lost. And that is the problem with like achievement mentality or whatever. You're always chasing something. And so yeah, I just felt like I didn't understand, like, oh, is this what we do for the rest of our lives? We get up and go to work and come home and never have time for anything, and we're tired. So, and I think I had a very demanding job at the time too. So I was really ultra stressed and pressed for time. So, um, I had never asked that kind of question before in my head. And so, but that started emerging. That was the existential crisis, was like, oh my God, is this it? This is what we do. And in science, or like the scientific materialist worldview, is that there's no meaning in the world. There's no external meaning. It's that we create meaning in our brains. And so, there's no purpose, like the universe is dead, random, and meaningless. And so when you have that in science as your religion, it's pretty depressing. You have nowhere to go from there, but just down into despair. So,
Are you at a point in your life where it's a compulsion for you to learn more and more and keep diving deeper down the rabbit hole?
I think yes, I think it's a little less intense now. At the beginning of the journey, it was a compulsion. It was a perfect word, actually. I'm very intense in that way. I get really into something and I wake up at like 3 a.m. and do this thing all day for months in a row, and then I'll take a break. And that's how it was for years with this. And then I think now I'm a little more comfortable taking things just slowly or as they come. It's not so much a compulsion anymore, but I'm still interested, open and learning more. Like, I think and I've always been that way. I've always liked learning. Obviously, like, I liked school and I liked learning. So I spent so much time doing it. So I enjoy it, but it's definitely slowed down the compulsion a little bit.
Have you tried doing things like hypnosis to see if you have a
Yes.
past life or anything?
Yeah, I tried. Well, I was super curious after I read all those books. So I tried past life regression, I think 3 times. And then it was really emotional, just like they said in the books. It was crazy. Like, they kept talking about this emotional catharsis, and I thought, okay, whatever. But I did it, and it was very emotional. Like, I think the first time it was like an Irish farm life, and I like after at the end of the life, we went to that space between lives, and my soul met with the other souls, and my therapist was like, oh, what is there anything you want to say to them, or is there anything they're saying to you? And then whatever we said to each other, I started like weeping, and I couldn't stop. It was crazy. Like, I never cry like that in normal therapy. And it was coming from like deep in my like, it was not like I felt sad and I cried. Like, it was a deep emotion. It really was a deep emotional catharsis. And all 3 of them were like that, to the point where I haven't done one in like 2 years because I'd have to mentally prepare for the emotional catharsis. I'm gonna have to prepare in advance for how much emotion pours out of me and like the week-long recovery. So yeah, and they weren't anything like, I think all 3 of them were, one of them was in like a life in New England, like around the Salem. It wasn't a witchcraft thing, but around that time, like Salem, which like that era, Puritans. And then one was in like ancient Greece or Rome. And so there wasn't anything like identifiable, but I did have like a few weird experiences. Like, one was I saw like a certain type of flower, and I'm not really even into flowers, so I didn't know what type of flower it was, but I went to look it up, which was hard because I didn't know what it was called. And I found that type of flower, like, it is, and I don't remember which one it was, but was native to I think it was to Greece. I think it was Greek life. It was native to Greece. And so, like, I didn't know that, but that flower was prominent in that past life regression. So I thought that was kind of interesting and weird. So I had little things like that happen for all of them. But there wasn't anything like, definitive where I could say for sure. And my therapist she's amazing, because I would talk to her about it. And she was saying she believes that it's like 50% maybe past life, 50% metaphor, but that no matter what you see or experience is like what you need to see or experience in that moment for for whatever type of healing you're trying to get. So that was another thing. Like at the beginning, I was very obsessed with, I need to know the facts. I need to know this is like an actual past life. And then later on, it turned into, I mean, does it really matter? Like, it doesn't matter. Or how are we ever really going to know? All that matters is, in a context like that, the therapeutic aspect is all that matters.
I find it fascinating that you had such an emotional response. What do you think was
Yeah.
causing that? And what were you so emotional about?
I mean, I think, so again, it's an altered state. And when you're in an altered state like that, your defenses are down. And so I think, I mean, you're looking at a person's whole life, right? Like I've just gone through this whole past life, and the lives were filled with like births and deaths and trauma and loss. So at the end, when you're meeting with other souls or stuff, or you're saying things, or you're even just thinking back on the entirety of the life, and like I said, your defenses are down. So it hits you like it really plucks those emotions, those deep emotions, and you release. And since your ego defenses are down, it's a deeper release than it would normally be, where you're like embarrassed that you're crying, so you stop yourself. So because you're relaxed, it just all comes out, and you're like not worried about, crying in front of someone. Or so it's just that's why it's such a deep release, and that's why it's such a good modality, because I think also it makes it easier in some way that it's not about your current life. So it removes some of that shame, which is why, like, that you would feel about crying about something. It's kind of about this other person's life. And there's some like drama therapy that works for PTSD in the same way. So there's all the, it's all related, but yeah, it's a very powerful therapeutic technique just to release emotions and address some of the things that are, deep inside your psyche that you normally can't get to.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me because a common thing we talk about here on the show is why we suffer so much in this existence. And so perhaps when you reviewed these lives, again, it was a life full of suffering. And you finally just released it all in one big event. You know what I mean? And if that's true, do you feel afterwards that it, relieved you somehow subconsciously?
Oh yeah. They actually, what's interesting is they all had different lessons, and they all relieved me emotionally, because you're having an emotional release, and so you immediately feel lighter. But they all had their own other things. Like one was my whatever, the person, whoever I was, had a really hard life, like a lot of loss. But in the past life, she, it was a woman, was always happy. And I remember at the end, my therapist always asks, what was the life lesson? And I remember like my ego started coming back, and I was like annoyed. And I'm like, the lesson was that happiness is a choice. And it's like, and I was telling her, like, afterward, when we were talking about it, I'm like, I just can't believe how happy she was given everything that happened to her. Like, why was she so happy? And she's like, like, it's a choice to be happy. And I was like, I don't know. It isn't, and it isn't. But they all had things like that where, like, it's such a profound realization that it kind of, sticks with you, and you think about it, and I'm reminded of it sometimes in my life. And also, if you get really into it, like you kind of embody the experience. So when you come out, it's not like you were watching a movie. It's like you actually felt what it was like to be happy despite all this loss. And then also, like, in one of the lives, I think I lost my parents early on. And so when I came back, like, I was so appreciative of my parents. I still have my parents in this life. And so it makes you really appreciative of like little things in your life. Even having like running warm water, things like that.
Besides what we've already spoken about, in what other ways has your spiritual journey with this book changed your day-to-day life?
Yeah, it changed the way I think about things a lot. It reframed my thinking. And that's actually what initially drew me in, I think, is I thought, okay, there's this spiritual framework that I'm learning about. What if it's true? What if I adopted it and started viewing things as lessons, or like asking, what am I supposed to be learning right now, instead of like, why is this happening to me? So I started doing that and reframing things. And also, like I said, I had kind of been asking, like, what is the meaning of life? Like, is this the meaning? We get up and go to work. And through a lot of the things that I read, some of them just said, oh, the meaning of life is like to just enjoy like your coffee, or enjoy the view, or enjoy the company of someone you love, or whatever. Like, that's the meaning. And so I tried that perspective on as well. And I found that all of those things just drastically improved my life and my day-to-day living in a way that I never would have thought that they would have. Like, if you just asked me, do you think that would happen? I would have said no, but it actually worked. And yeah, I was just like, wow, spirituality, or whatever, this like psychological reframing with this narrative is extremely useful. And it really improved my day-to-day well-being. So I still use it to this day.
That's great. Well, what is the most important thing that a reader should take away from your book?
I think that there's a lot of mysteries, that we should all be more open-minded and curious. Like I wasn't, I am trying to be now. And then I think that I do believe there's a spiritual or mystical dimension, or there's a lot that we don't understand about the universe, but there's a lot to be in awe of, right? I mean, it's like, it's really wondrous. And I personally embrace these altered states for therapeutic reasons, or like for getting insights or releasing emotions, like we talked about. And I think our society should really support these more, instead of just focusing on our chemical makeup, right? Like um, prescription drugs and stuff. Like, these states are really, really healing in ways that we're not getting from our other healing modalities.
After watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that? And if so,
Yeah,
how do they reach you?
of course. Yeah, I have a website. It's monasobhaniphd.com. Everything's there. Links to my book. There's a contact page. So yeah, they can reach out that way.
Do you have anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
I've been writing a Substack called The Brave New World of Psychedelic Science, but in January I'm switching to a new one, and that's where you can catch my writing about science and spirituality. And the new one's it's on my website, but it's so new, I have to remember the name. It's Cosmos, Science, and Coffee, I think.
Well, that's interesting that you're into psychedelics. Are you going to start experimenting with them yourself?
I did. They were part of my journey. I wrote about it a little bit in the book, but on the Substack, which I've been writing for 2 years now, I've written a lot about that. And it started off as just a summary of the research of psychedelics and how therapeutic they are, as a public service, because I was surprised at what I read, so I wanted to share it. And then I started writing about the transpersonal aspect. So with all of these altered states of consciousness, including psychedelics, not only are they therapeutic, but paranormal weird things happen much more significantly than they do in normal states of consciousness. So like instances of telepathy, or suddenly knowing someone has died, someone who's far away that you weren't expecting to die, seeing beings like angels or elves or whatever. So I write a lot about that, like what that means, and what it means for science, what it means for spirituality, what it means for humanity.
Well, what did you take and what did you experience?
So I've tried a few different ones, but in the book I talk about an LSD trip that I took, and LSD was it was beautiful for me. It was great. You never know what you're going to get with psychedelics, though. So it's all about set and setting, and your state of mind and all that. But it was so what I referred to before about the depth of emotion was really clear with all psychedelics, but definitely with the LSD. It was like just my emotions were blown open. It's crazy how quickly they can change. So if you're playing music and like the music suddenly becomes really happy, it's like you're there. And if it switches to like down, but you feel the depths of the emotion like you've never felt before. And so you just come to know yourself and you're like the way you are in a totally different way. And that's what happened. And then also I felt like electricity. I guess that's kind of like what they call the Kundalini energy from your spine, the base of your spine up to the top of your head. I felt that like literally it was like electricity running up my spine and through my arms and legs. And I had to get up and dance to get the energy out because it was like too much energy. I didn't know what to do with it. And I just felt, yeah, like all this love and interconnection to everything. And it was just a really beautiful experience. And then on another experience that I had, I actually, what we talked about earlier about your awareness, kind of being separate from your mind, I actually experienced that happening. And I like this actual separation of my small mind and then my awareness, and my awareness kind of looking back on my small mind and like, oh, you're still talking, like you're still talking. And eventually in that experience, that fell away and I became the entire universe, all of space and time. And I didn't exist anymore as an individual ego, as an individual person. I just dissolved and became all of space and time. And that was, again, like, it's so hard to put these experiences into words. That's why they're called ineffable. But it's like a state of expansion, is the best way I can explain it. Expansion and the understanding. This is why actually I lean towards philosophies that say consciousness is fundamental, because that's what I experienced in that state. And it was like I was every particle of the universe, but I wasn't me, but I was every particle of the universe and I was conscious. And so I was the entire universe, all of space and time. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to put into words, but that was literally the experience. And so then you come out and you read a philosophy and you're like, that's like, maybe consciousness is a fundamental aspect. You're like, yes, that's what I experienced. That's what it is.
Thank you for sharing your experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Yeah, I think that there actually is a lot of support, like not only that the universe is spiritual or mystical or wondrous, or I think there actually is a lot of support for us, even if it's invisible. I think there's a lot of support, of course, between us, if we could just access a little more compassion and empathy. But I think that we're more supported than we think. And I take a lot of comfort in that idea now, which I would have thought was crazy before. But I tell people that all the time. And I think that also it's okay to, I used to, because of all my training, I think feel a lot of shame about spirituality in the beginning of this journey. And after I did so much research, looking into the benefits, like literally the physical and mental health benefits of spirituality, and also just ditching the shame, because it's not like we know for a fact either way. I think I just encourage people to like share their stories. I think these are human experiences. I think everyone's had them or will have them. So I think it's important that we share them with each other, and yeah, lean into your spirituality and don't feel bad about it.
Dr. Sobhani, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.